Hi everyone. So in this video we're trying something different by counting down the 20 games I streamed all the way through in 2023. And that's the first distinction to make here at the start. This won't be the 20 best games of 2023 or the 20 games I'd recommend to other people. Rather, it's a quick look back at the games we streamed over the course of the year, and now, after a few months to get some perspective, how they rank up in my memory. I want to jump in right away, but a couple quick notes. First, this list is incredibly subjective. I play a lot of different games here from a bunch of different genres, and ranking them all in one list, it's not comparing apples to oranges. This is more like comparing apples to screwdrivers, to poetry, to excitement. They're way too different to actually rate against one another, so more than most lists, this is really just a ranking of how fondly I remember each experience. Secondly, I always want to be careful of spoilers, so I won't be talking much about any major plot reveals or surprise late-game mechanics. Most of the footage is taken from the early parts of our playthrough, but there are a couple exceptions. So although we really wanted to make something interesting to watch, anyone who's keen on spoilers might want to just listen along, or if you're curious for full spoilers, we usually break things down in the final episode of every playthrough, so hey, check out our collections or our playlists. Finally, I'd like to give a specific shout out to Mark Quack for inspiring this video by asking this specific question right at the end of 2023, what was my favorite game that we streamed all year? I realized over the last several months that I really enjoy watching people show off things they enjoy and feel enthusiastic about, and now that I've had some time to consider this question, I think it's an opportunity to do just that. Starting at the bottom, 12 Minutes is the investigative time loop thriller by Luis Antonio about a man reliving the same attack on his home every few minutes. The goal is to uncover who this intruder is and why he believes there's something valuable enough in this 2.5 room apartment to kill for. Now, you'll learn a good deal about these characters and their stories by replaying the same sequence again and again, and there's some good satisfaction in unlocking new dialogue options and interactions to begin cutting straight towards the truth. It's also impressive how many subtle permutations there are, where the characters will respond to slight adjustments in your approach, in ways that show the developers really try to consider all the different things that players might try. But that's where I still think that 12 Minutes stumbles, on those inevitable loops where you believe you have something new to try, only to discover after sitting through the same sequences for the 10th time that no, it all resulted in exactly the same outcome. I'm also not sure how to really fix that, since allowing you to simply skip forward on dialogue would eliminate that "oh wait" moment, where you realize that an initially unremarkable comment might actually be a little clue. But the biggest issue with 12 Minutes is ultimately with how it all resolves. I truly don't want to spoil the experience for anyone else simply because of my reaction to it, so I'll speak very carefully when I say, when the main point of the mystery is to uncover the truth, it should probably be a worrying sign if success means uncovering information you earnestly wish you didn't know. A bit of an oddity in the current market, Erica is a full-motion video game about a young woman who finds it hard to distance herself from a traumatic past when someone starts leaving human remains on her doorstep. It's another mystery-themed game as the police move her to a more secure facility which, as it happens, was co-founded by her deceased father. This sort of strange plot development contributes to a hazy, dreamlike quality that I quite enjoyed in the late-night session where we recorded the playthrough. There's an air of unnaturalness about the people and the location so that everything feels a bit off, and it's greatly enhanced by some solid performances, moody lighting, and an excellent soundtrack composed by Austin Wintry. Erica is an engaging thriller for a single playthrough, which might run just a touch over 2 hours. But despite an opening screen encouraging multiple playthroughs to uncover the full story, the few new details I picked up in a second run were slight enough that it wasn't worth stressing when those VODs mysteriously couldn't be published. The touchpad-only interface was also a curious choice, but again, in a weird way, its jittery imprecision actually seemed fitting for a story with such an eerie tone. It was a neat experiment that I enjoyed trying out, but on the whole, I'm glad it was included as part of our PSN subscription instead of a separate purchase. This is an early position on the list for Stray, and that should not be read as a dig against Stray, but rather an examination of how high the median was for the games that we played in 2023. Stray is a story about a cat making their way through a post-apocalyptic setting populated by intelligent androids who inhabit this village of rundown shanties and a swarm of ravenous headcrabs that devour anything that wanders into their shadows. Now, you're not an anthropomorphic cat or even a talking cat, so in order to provide some sort of direction, you soon come across an electronic backpack with a little drone that's hoping to learn what happened to some droids that tried to escape the village. This means Stray is ultimately about getting caught up in someone else's story, presumably in the hopes that if you're successful, you can get back to where you came from and resume what you were doing before. But as long as the human at the controls is engaged by discovering the history of this strange world, getting to do so as a regular domestic cat is a unique joy. With some great looking environments, solid controls, an intriguing setting, and some great animation work, particularly for your cat, which is where they really needed to nail it, Stray is a solid platformer that felt well paced for its 8-hour playthrough. I also appreciated the way it embraced the fact that your character is just a regular cat, with opportunities to bat things off of ledges, or take naps, or claw things in the environment, which generated some super satisfying responses on the PS5's haptic triggers. It's definitely worth grabbing if you're subscribed to PS Plus. Pentiment is a lovingly crafted narrative game focused on conversation, investigation, and witnessing the consequences of your actions as they affect the story and the town around you. At the start, you'll be introduced to the main character, Andreas Mahler, an artist working at the nearby Abbey on a special project. But once he becomes involved in a crime investigation, the decisions you make about his background and how to follow up on potential leads will have a big impact on how things play out. On top of that, Pentiment is presented in this highly distinctive art style based on the era in which it occurs, and it's loaded with special animation flourishes and little details, like the way elderly characters in the world appear as though the ink used to draw them has become faded and started to flake away. The lettering used to present the voices of different characters is sometimes updated to a different script as you learn more about them, and people from different regions are depicted with an art style from that part of the world. Pentiment is the sort of game you'll want to replay just for the chance to pick up on all the little nuances you might have missed before, not to mention all the alternative story paths there are to explain through the main acts. So, you might be wondering why it appears so early on this list. Well, it's because in order to get through to all the things that Pentiment does so well, I found I had to push through some of the most slowly paced opening hours of any game I can remember. I usually prefer games that take time to establish the world and characters before things kick off. Earlier in this very list, I felt that Erica could have used more of that. So it's really saying something when I say that Pentiment's decision to open by introducing a dozen-plus characters through a lot of mundane conversations and period-appropriate immersion was a bit too far in the other direction. But if you're willing to commit to it and push through those opening hours, you will find a story like no other that I've played and be highly rewarded for the effort it took to get there. SteamWorld Build is the first game I've tried in the franchise, as the others fell a little bit outside the genres I usually play. But this one combines the supply chain city building of Anno with the underground excavation and defensive combat of Dungeon Keeper, which put it right in my wheelhouse. It's also a great entry point to these concepts, with a gentle difficulty curve, plenty of space to satisfy your needs, and a relaxed pace that lets you explore and tackle new challenges on your own schedule. Despite the tone of looming apocalypse conveyed by the story, nothing in the mechanics is there to hurry you along, making for a nice, relaxing, bite-sized city builder. SteamWorld Build appears rather early in this list for me because, while it's very charming conceptually with its Old West-themed robots, it feels like there's little motivation to replay once you've run through the full story. Of course, I had the same concern with Anno 2205, and I've returned to that more than a few times over the years, so I might find myself returning to SteamWorld whenever I'm in the mood for a lighter version. If you're not sure whether you'd enjoy a city builder about supply chains and service areas with a little bit of light tower defense on the side, SteamWorld Build could be a great opportunity to find out. And for me, I found it a neat little combination of genres that I enjoyed that felt well paced over its 12-hour story. Another game on the shorter side, Far Lone Sails is the one game on the list that almost feels like it exists in its own unique genre. Simply calling it a puzzle game or an adventure game will fail to capture the focus it places on vehicle operation and maintenance as you attempt to pilot a multi-story Land Rover, well, over to the right. Where you're going or what you hope to accomplish is not especially clear because, aside from a couple labels inside the vehicle, there's no text or dialogue to kickstart the narrative. Filling in those blanks is definitely part of the journey, and with a playtime of only about 3 or 4 hours, I want to be careful not to ruin any part of that discovery. This is a game that teaches you entirely through context. It reminds me of playing Super Mario Bros. For the first time, except instead of learning how to stomp enemies and jump over bottomless pits to see what's on the other side, you'll be working out how to operate this odd vehicle, and the fact that it feels designed for a small crew, but you're here making the trip alone. Like I said, this is a game where context matters. Lone Sails really benefits from its striking art choices, with its grayscale world punctuated by these deep crimsons and bright teals to draw your attention to important objects. And the music, as your only companion, does a masterful job of setting the tone for this daring, possibly desperate voyage into unknown lands. Lone Sails is a short game, but also a marvelously paced one that feels like it wraps up exactly as you see in all the neat variations on its central navigation mechanics. It also leaves a tantalizing opening for a sequel, which, based on this experience, we're very much looking forward to playing later this year. I entered into Subnautica Below Zero resolving to use all the knowledge I'd gained from the first game, carrying buoys to mark important locations during exploration, getting a base up and running early, not being shy about building smaller outposts as needed, that sort of thing. And those lessons definitely smoothed the learning curve so I could focus on all the things the sequel has improved. The big standout is the game engine. The original Subnautica was a great game, plagued by random frame rate drops, texture issues, movement bugs, especially while walking on land, and some of the most extreme geometry pop-in I think I've ever seen. But in Below Zero, all those issues are just gone. The game looks and plays fantastically all the way through. It also ramps up the overall feeling of menace in the world. I really enjoyed exploring underwater wrecks and cavern complexes in the first game, and with the amount of effort that developers put into making those sections more intricate and more rewarding, I was clearly not alone. There are a few missteps in the new game, primarily with the number of steps you wind up taking. I mean on land, because presumably, for the sake of variety, a surprising amount of Below Zero takes place up on the ice, which just feels kind of out of place. It never feels broken like it would in the first game, but there's just this feeling like all your sleek underwater tech is being clumsily repurposed, and I was always looking forward to getting back under the waves. Still, these are the only 2 survival crafting games that I've been excited to play all the way through. And the fact that the developer backported all those technical fixes from Below Zero into the previous game, a step very few companies would ever think to do, makes me even more excited about supporting their next venture. Up next, Deliver Us Mars is the direct sequel to Deliver Us the Moon, a game I had never even heard of until marketing for the sequel started spooling up. Which is weird, because I love narrative-heavy games, especially if they have an air of mystery to them. I decided to jump into the series knowing as little as possible beyond that, and found that, yeah, they were both right up my alley. Now, I played them both in 2023, and we'll talk some about the first game in a little bit, but it's pretty common for video game sequels to improve upon their predecessors, so why is Deliver Us Mars ranking a bit lower than Deliver Us the Moon? It's certainly not for lack of ambition. Rather than sending you out on another solo mission, Deliver Us Mars is centered on a small team of astronauts on a mission to the Red Planet, and through some excellent voice acting and storytelling beats, they're all active participants in the story. This largely replaces that feeling of haunting isolation with a much more cinematic and interpersonal story about how this group of people will deal with everything they learn. There's still a strong drive to learn about what happened in the past, but now there's a more immediate tension about what's going to happen next. It's also got more inventive puzzles and traversal mechanics than the first game. Everything I liked about Deliver Us the Moon is still here, but those comparatively basic power cell puzzles have been swapped out for some cool laser beam puzzles that make this world's technology more distinct. But that ambition to craft a bigger, longer, more sophisticated game is ultimately what knocked Deliver Us Mars down a few pegs. Because its shortcomings are all in the technical department. The ray tracing that looks great, except when it's completely changing someone's hair color. The climbing axes that sometimes just fail to catch on to an appropriate surface. The facial animations, which look at least passable in cutscenes, but then go completely slack during regular gameplay. These issues detract from the overall presentation, but they exist for the simple reason that the developers wanted to exercise their creativity and push themselves to build something better. That's impressive, and while I have to acknowledge those technical foibles exist, I also find them easy to forgive from a small independent studio with a big story to tell. I'd also like to note that a few patches have been released since I played in April 2023, and we've heard from our streaming friend Harmonious Crow that a lot of the issues that I encountered have been fixed since then, so good on them for continuing to work on it. And now, from a game whose reach exceeded its grasp to one that vastly exceeded expectations, Dying Light 2 is a game I genuinely thought would never be released. It was reportedly in development for years, eventually announced with a release date, and then delayed 2 years beyond that. It absolutely looked to be lost in development hell. It's a backstory worth sharing because to play the finished product, you'd never know Dying Light 2 had so much as a stumble on its way to release. The combat is fast and fluid, with an emphasis on crowd control and watching your back like you'd want in a zombie survival game. And the parkour mechanics feel even better than the first game, with a greater variety of moves to chain together and even more options that unlock about halfway through. The main story is more sober and grounded than the first game, but never crosses the line into becoming grim or dour. It actually has some of the most likable characters I encountered all year, which gave a lot more weight to the major decision points that come up during the plot. I think the only real downside to Dying Light 2 is a kind of inevitable one. Once I had a few levels under my belt and felt more comfortable with the movement, the world lost a lot of its initial menace. There was still plenty of incentive to do things quietly and efficiently, but I really missed that early dread of seeing the sun get low on the horizon and realizing I was a long run from safety. Techland has continued to support Dying Light 2 with frequent updates like new patches, new features, new storylines, and special challenges. They even reworked the dismemberment mechanics and parkour motion in direct response to fan feedback. This really does feel like it's been a labor of love, so if you have any fondness for the original, this one is an easy recommendation.
I've been kept inside so long.
Narrative games represent one of my favorite genres, and one of the most common criticisms I hear is that a lot of times people don't feel like their choices wind up affecting the story. My experience has always been rather different. When I make a choice that provokes an emotional response from a character or opens up a new line of questioning, those interactions will absolutely change how I feel about the story. My understanding is shaped not only by what happens, but how it all unfolds. And no game seemed better poised to explore that than Road 96. A gift to the community from the wonderful viewer and our streaming friend Mr. Hiseo Ryu, Road 96 is a procedurally arranged narrative game about a procession of teenagers fleeing political violence in their home country. Many of the broader elements will be common to every playthrough, like the fact that there's a highly contentious presidential election looming and things are becoming more and more unstable as the weeks roll by. But the specifics, especially the order that events unfold, will vary wildly from one playthrough to another. I know because when I checked out Hiseo's playthrough, his adventure started with a sequence I didn't encounter until the very end, a change that would have greatly impacted my early understanding of the world. This is a remarkably ambitious idea that uses this road trip style framing to its fullest, gradually weaving the complete story out of the small slices that each of your playable characters encounters on their path. And as I learned early on, this journey is a perilous one. Some of your teams might not complete the journey, and the parts of the story you don't get will also affect how things go. There's nothing else out there quite like Road 96. My playthrough truly felt like a unique experience, and whatever it might lack in graphical fidelity or AAA animation, its dedication to trying something so inventive in the narrative space made for a highly memorable journey. When I first started up Spiritfarer, it felt like a warm blend of gentle platforming, light crafting, and hints of some skill progression that would reward coming back to areas a little later. It's bright and cartoony, with some of the most vibrant 2D animation work of any game I've played, and the cast of animalistic characters like a haughty deer and a doting old serpent seem like they'd be good company for all ages. It felt like a delightful entry point for anyone interested in trying out an exploration and crafting game. And all of those things are true. There's no dark heart of corruption beating behind this world, no sudden shift to the sinister or the macabre. This is very much the sort of game where you'll never be in any danger of failing, but fully engaging with the mini-games to gather or process materials is rewarded with greater success. Spiritfarer wants you to succeed because you have an important job to do. You see, Stella is the brand new ferry master for the deceased. The ship she's building up with all those specialized accommodations isn't just for exploration. She's seeking out souls who are starting to feel the pull to move on and just need a little bit of help setting their affairs in order before they go. Spiritfarer is a game about death. Not in a cheap or tawdry way, it's about regret, denial, loss, and also acceptance, friendship, and cherished memories. All wrapped up in this pleasant summertime archipelago, so when those more somber story beats hit, they can hit hard. My understanding is that the writers for Spiritfarer drew from real-life stories to flesh out its cast of passengers. That effort really shows, and I suspect that anyone who's lost someone close to them will find at least one story here that hits close to home. I certainly did. There were a couple of stories where I needed to let the text play out on its own, so Spiritfarer is a great place to break into our top 10. Streaming on a reliable and consistent schedule is tough, what with real life being a thing and all, but I always look forward to those times when we can have a specific game dedicated to a particular time slot. And Potion Permit was an absolutely perfect fit for an early morning weekend stream. I think it's mostly the time management aspect. Potion Permit isn't really a game where you're in any danger of failing, but it shares the same curiously addictive quality as Stardew Valley, where you'll want to wring the most out of every day. There are meals to cook and upgrades to forge, materials to gather and quests to pursue, and even if tomorrow is another day, trying to make the most efficient use out of my video game routine put me in a good mindset for the real day. Potion Permit is distinct from Stardew in that your role as the town's new alchemist makes you responsible for curing all of the citizens' ailments. So, rather than farming and unlocking better ways to till the land, you're marching out into the wilderness to forage for the ingredients you need to mix potions by basically arranging Tetris pieces into a grid. I think each concoction has a number of different solutions, so just like everything in the game, it's easy to succeed and rewarding to figure out how to do it with the fewest possible components. There were a few touches that surprised me in Potion Permit. The town physically changed as I completed personal quests for the villagers, which gave some nice visual feedback on the impact I was having on the community. I was also surprised and a little disappointed that in the entire playthrough, there was only one major outbreak that brought multiple people into the infirmary at once. This might have been a balancing concern since incapacitated shopkeepers can't man the registers, but it would have been cool to have to scramble a bit in response to a sudden epidemic. Potion Permit also has an extremely cool feature where your dog can lead you directly to any villager you're trying to find. See, they move around throughout the day, with different schedules depending on the day of the week, so having your dog sniff out a path directly to them is so elegant and so smart. It's remarkable this is the first time I've seen it done this naturally. Big thanks to our friend Azric for recommending this one. Fans of the channel, and anyone awesome enough to have made it this far into the list, thank you very, very much by the way, has surely noticed that I'm partial to games with strong story elements, some opportunities for open exploration, or maybe some strategic components. But I'm also a lifelong fan of the Zelda games, and sometimes it's great to cleanse the old gaming palette with an old-school combat puzzle game. Death's Door is exactly that. A tightly designed isometric game about a crow who works at a bureau of Grim Reapers and gets swept up in an alleged conspiracy. The story unfolds as you explore the world to capture giant souls from different area bosses, and I enjoyed how the game played with the idea of these powerful entities that clung on to life beyond their allotted time. But the real highlight of the game is the tight, challenging, isometric combat that pits you against a variety of different enemies. And it feels like the game knows, just as you're getting comfortable taking on one sort of foe, it'll start teaming them up with other types that will force a change to your approach. There are plenty of puzzles to solve in order to progress, but where Zelda games feel like puzzle games with a bit of combat to break them up, Death's Door inverts that ratio and reserves the more advanced puzzles for optional power-ups, so you're never too stumped to reach the next story point. This is a great, well-structured 10 to 15 hour game that made for a refreshing break between longer playthroughs, and we'd be lucky to have more experiences just like it. So, you may have noticed that I was especially vague when talking about the story of Deliver Us Mars earlier in the video. And that's because the story starts with Deliver Us the Moon, and, well, now we can get into the premise a bit. The stakes are set up before you even reach the title screen. It's the near future, and the Earth is basically a dust bowl, and the resulting global crisis has been somewhat eased by a lunar colony that processes helium-3 and beams the energy back home. Then, after a couple successful decades, the power transmission stopped, and the colony simply went silent. You play as a lone astronaut who's going to use a very precious amount of fuel to get out there, try to figure out what happened, and, if at all possible, get the lights back on. That introductory setup is as specific as I'm going to get about the story. My personal sweet spot is when I know enough about the premise to feel intrigued, but get to learn everything else by engaging with the world like the writers intended. They've threaded a thorough and coherent story through notes and audio logs, and pulling all those strands together to form the complete tapestry is one of the reasons Deliver Us the Moon ranked so high with me. There's also the sheer technical prowess on display. I guess the original release was really rough, but I can only comment on the version that I played, which was truly gorgeous. There's a quality to the way light bounces off of materials in the game, shines through your visor, or reflects off of glass that even other ray-traced games have failed to match. It's a real showcase for what even small indie studios can accomplish with time and the right talent. I also found the blend of third and first-person sequences to be incredibly seamless, to the point where I'd struggle to remember which was more common. I definitely picked up on the fact that the third person was more common for exploration and puzzle sequences, while playing from inside the suit really ratcheted up the claustrophobia for the action parts. Most games are designed very tightly around just one perspective, so making them both feel so perfectly natural is another testament to the developer's skill. Finally, again, without going into too much detail, the story in Deliver Us the Moon and Mars really hooked me in, and even though I was briefly confused about where the second game landed in the timeline, the characters and themes presented in the series really hit home. I talk a lot about those in the final episode for each game, but for now, I'm just hoping they can make this into a trilogy. I grew up wanting to enjoy adventure games and not. Here was this entire genre centered on their stories and characters and worlds to explore, but with nearly every single one, I'd hit a wall where I just couldn't figure out how to move forward. After a while, I figured adventure games just weren't for me. The Excavation of Hobbs Barrow looks just like those old games, but similar to Unavowed a couple years back, it's a vastly more player-friendly experience than I remember from back in the day. After a pretty cryptic prologue, the story picks up with a historian and author named Thomasina Bateman arriving in the remote village of Bewley, where she's been invited to help dig up an ancient burial mound. The locals call it Hobbs Barrow, and it's alternately a local landmark that everybody knows is just too difficult to reach, a completely mundane pile of dirt of no conceivable interest, or a place no one has ever even heard of, and why specifically are you asking anyway? And deepening the mystery, the man who invited Thomasina is nowhere to be found. This is something the Excavation of Hobbs Barrow gets exactly right. The odd feeling of unease that these folks might not fully get along with one another, but they're broadly united in their distaste for visitors. It feels like walking in on an argument between strangers who have just enough decorum to set aside their differences until you have the good sense to leave. I always aim to play games with as little foreknowledge as possible, and Hobbs Barrow is a great example of why. I had no idea what direction this was going to take. Are these people being cagey and standoffish because there's something wrong in Bewley? Or do they just mistrust fancy folk from the bigger cities? And I had no idea if there's anything special about that burial mound or if it's just a superstitious icon that people want to avoid discussing. Those are answers I surely won't be exploring here, as my description would miss out on all the great voice acting, music, and quality of life features that keep the mystery so engaging through to the end. This is the sort of game that reinvigorates my interest in a whole genre, so if you have any fondness for adventure games in your past, I recommend checking it out. Cracking into the top 5 now, we have the game that I expected to be the Arkham Origins of the Spider-Man franchise. That is to say, a sort of interstitial game, with its own story and some revamped mechanics to tide you over until the next main release. I'd heard Miles Morales was good and kind of on the short side, which fit pretty well with its lighter price tag. And it's not like any of those things are wrong, but it is so much more. Having New York City redressed for wintertime was a nice change of pace, but I was much more taken by the updated combat system. It starts off feeling much like the first game, but very quickly, Miles realizes that his spider powers are developing along a different track than Peter's, allowing him to unleash devastating power strikes that just feel fantastic to land. But the real draw for me was the story, which felt as lovingly crafted and complete as the first one. Miles has a family and friends and schoolmates, and this whole local community he knows through his mom's political work. If you'll allow me an extremely minor spoiler here, one of the new friends Miles meets is a young woman who communicates with him through American Sign Language, which then Miles wants to become more fluent in so he can interact more easily. This strong sense of immediate community, more than any other single thing, helps establish the stakes for the story and keep it grounded in the lives it affects. The next thing I say is one of the reasons I wanted to wait a while to craft this list, to be sure I still felt this way. So please take this as a considered opinion that as much as I enjoyed the other games on this list, Miles Morales has the strongest ending of the year. I won't discuss it further here for obvious reasons, and man, I don't want to oversell it, but I have gone back several times to watch how it all came together at the end. If Miles Morales had been the first game in the franchise, or I don't know, maybe 30% longer with the amount of content to carry that length, it might very well have topped this list. I enjoyed it that much. But probably because it is an interstitial game that left me wanting more, there are a handful of games that edge it out. Shadow Gambit is a top-down, real-time tactical stealth game about undead pirates conducting covert operations against a totalitarian religious inquisition. And if you're thinking to yourself, oh no, not another one of those, I would really like to live in your world, because I've never played anything like Shadow Gambit before. I've heard of the studio's other games, Shadow Tactics and Desperados 3, and if they're anything like this, I've really been missing out. Most missions have you taking a team of 3 pirates behind enemy lines to sneak, steal, and gather intel against the Inquisition, with the specific party members in time of day having a pretty big effect on just how the operation is going to play out. Outside of their basic takedowns, every crewmate has their own unique set of skills that can combo with each other in a bunch of inventive ways. And as varied as the mission situations are, it's clear that tons of balancing work went into making every possible party combination feel rewarding. A big part of this is the save system, which explicitly tells you right from the start, save scumming is an intended design feature and you are absolutely expected to reload out of your blunders. This ability to roll back time and retry things is even written into the plot. So where some stealth games can be needlessly punishing, the trial and error aspects of Shadow Gambit always feels like unraveling a little pack of puzzles, and learning how to make better use of your crewmates in the process. Finishing Shadow Gambit was a bittersweet experience, as the developers announced shortly after release that this would be their final project. This is very disappointing, given the obvious passion and talent on display here, and I just hope they can go forward knowing that they went out on a real banger. and at least I know that I've got their previous releases available to check out at some point in the future. Entering into the top 3 games now with something of a cheat. I technically did not stream Star Trek Resurgence. For this one, we recorded the playthrough all the way through, and then released it all together as an extra bonus for fans of the channel. This feels like the best option for these Telltale-style narrative games that are so centered around dialogue and plot advancement, so everyone gets to enjoy the story at their own pace. And Resurgence has a great story, particularly for how well it recaptures that late Next Generation era of Star Trek. The uniforms and computer displays are all there, but it goes beyond that. There's an attention to detail in the lighting and the soundtrack and the way the dialogue is delivered that feels like a love letter to a very particular part of the franchise's history. The plot centers on a seemingly simple diplomatic mission to stabilize mounting tensions between 2 quarreling species, and as you might expect from a really good multi-episode arc of the TV series, this curious labor dispute expands into scientific investigations and clandestine away missions as the crew pieces together what's really going on. Of all the games on this list, Star Trek Resurgence feels the most subjective, the most personal. Because if you have no nostalgia for this part of Star Trek or don't care for narrative games in general, I don't think this one is going to change your mind. The game is a bit janky, with shooting and scanning and piloting mechanics that feel rather like unpolished interruptions to the story. I was also surprised to discover that most menus in the game, including tutorials, include a button prompt to immediately exit out to the title screen and sacrifice some of your progress on the way. But if you're in the target audience for this homage to this now classic style of Star Trek, the excellent voice acting, sound work, and lore callbacks make Resurgence feel like the launch of a new series. And there is a ton of sequel potential here, so hopefully we'll be able to revisit these characters with you someday in the future. For our number 2 game, I'm going to put it very simply. As a sequel to Horizon Zero Dawn, Forbidden West is more than what I had been hoping for. I want to start there because I think it sets a good baseline for a lot of the basic stuff you might imagine in a video game sequel. Better visuals, expanded mechanics, new enemy types, that sort of thing. And instead of listing out all the things it does well, which would take a very long time, I want to focus in on the things that took me by surprise. First, there's the reworked skill tree system. You still get the same sort of stat boosts and inventory perks that you saw in the first game, but investing in a particular tree now also unlocks new techniques for specific weapon types. These are things like empowering the rope caster to hook into enemies without needing to charge up, lay down proximity mines with the Shredder Gauntlet, and, my personal favorite, transforming the Burstfire Bolt Blaster into a devastating Gatling gun that can obliterate large targets. It gives all the weapon types a more varied and distinctive use, with more overall personality that makes them feel rewarding to experiment with. Then, and I admit this might just be for me, I thought the inventory and economy systems were perfectly balanced. In the first game, I was rolling in currency and crafting materials from a very early point, so quest rewards and machine kills didn't mean too much. But in Forbidden West, money and components are precious enough that, for the entire game, I was making weighty decisions about which new pieces of gear or upgrades or exotic ammo types were the smartest investment. And Aloy is now limited in how much she can carry at one time, with any surplus pickups automatically going to her stash back at camp, so there's a good reason to regularly touch base with Civilization. Finally is the story, which addressed expectations from the ending of Zero Dawn, and then spun them off into new and more ambitious directions. There's a greater sense now of symbiosis between the humans and the machines, such as the Utaru, who venerate their robotic land gods, even as they mulch the farmland into virulent rot. Returning characters are expanded upon and developed as Aloy makes dozens of new contacts, friend and foe alike, who keep the stakes grounded in how events affect regular people just trying to do the best they can. And the main antagonist, who I assumed would be something of a rematch for Aloy, instead expanded the lore in ways that I just didn't see coming. This is the very best kind of sequel, one that takes everything fans enjoyed about its predecessor and builds them out in ways that put a new perspective on things they thought were all figured out. Any criticisms I have about the clunky sorting options for equipment buffs or the utility belt interface pale in comparison to all the things Forbidden West gets so perfectly right. This game is a masterpiece, and I suspect it will rank alongside the very best this console generation will have to offer. So, if that's number 2, what game did I like better than that? Marvel's Midnight Suns feels like the sum of everything I enjoy in gaming. It's also a remarkably expansive game with lots of different systems and gameplay loops that all interlock and build on one another, which makes it kind of hard to explain. Fortunately, we just worked through this big list of games that I liked, so let's take a look at this game with all of that information in mind. First, I like stories that I can engage with and feel invested in the outcome. Deliver Us the Moon and Mars, Star Trek, Horizon, Hobbs Barrow. Midnight Suns opens by introducing Lilith, a demonic witch who's made a pass at global domination long ago and very narrowly wound up dead. She's over that now and ready for a second try, with her opening move being the effortless takeover of Doctor Strange's headquarters, the highly defended Sanctum Sanctorum. Lilith swatting aside Earth's mightiest heroes and taking whatever she wants establishes right away this is not an enemy they are ready to face. But they know someone who could. Her last rampage ended very abruptly by the hand of her own offspring, a warrior known only in legend as the Hunter, who also died in that encounter. So, in need of a place to regroup and organize a counteroffensive, Doctor Strange and friends gather in a well-hidden abbey to bring the Hunter back to life. That's the setup and where the game starts in full. Hunter is the original, more customizable character you get to control. I went with the default female Hunter who appears in all the promo art, so you'll probably see a lot of her in all the footage here. It also sets up why heroes like Doctor Strange, Iron Man, and Captain Marvel are suddenly moving in with lesser-known colleagues like Nico Minoru, Magik, and a young Ghost Rider. They were there first, honing skills that happen to be well-suited against demonic sorcery, and along with their mentor Blade, they very much do not appreciate being treated like the B-team. This leads us to probably the most divisive aspect of Midnight Suns, the fact that between combat missions, there's a social system where Hunter gets to hang out with the other heroes and develop their friendships. Now, personally, I like checking in with people in Pentiment, Road 96, and Shadow Gambit. Even if the arc of their day doesn't directly influence the plot, getting to know the principal characters as human beings makes the world feel that much more alive. Every teammate in Midnight Suns has their own storyline and interactions, and there's a gameplay benefit too. As your friendship level goes up, each hero will unlock unique bonuses. Blade gets a chance to make enemies bleed from every attack. Captain Marvel can start reflecting damage. Magik gains access to more portals, and so on. Every hero has a specialty they can lean into. And then there's the team's training level, which rises through daily sparring matches and boosts everybody's environmental attacks. This is, structurally, a westernized Persona game, where combat sections are interspersed with the chance to spend downtime with the team and expand the story through their perspectives. There are even dialogue choices that influence how well your hangouts go. I enjoyed checking in with people in Forbidden West and Spiritfarer and Potion Permit just because, so unlocking tactical buffs by investing in those friendships is a system I absolutely adore. Look, I leave a wide latitude for people to enjoy games in very different ways, and if you bounce off of Midnight Suns because of the friendship simulator parts, I felt like they were entirely optional, but that's still fair. It was just very surprising for me to learn that this was the contentious part of Midnight Suns for a lot of players, given how much people like getting to know their teammates in Mass Effect, Dragon Age, and Fire Emblem. And I haven't played Baldur's Gate 3 yet, but I've heard that chatting up party members there is pretty popular too. For me, Getting to know these characters and learning about this version of the Marvel Universe from their experiences is really valuable for transforming them from just a pile of stat blocks and abilities into people with a personal stake in the story. It was every bit as integral to the game as the combat missions, and those, by the way, are phenomenal. The lead designer for Midnight Suns was Jake Solomon, a Firaxis developer who served in the same role for the modern versions of XCOM and XCOM 2. Those games are excellent, so you'd be forgiven for expecting Midnight Suns to be that in tights. But it isn't. That isn't here. And I just want to underscore that with a foundation as strong as XCOM 2 War of the Chosen to work from, one of the best games I have ever played, Jake Solomon and his team decided instead to start from scratch and build something completely different. Every round of Midnight Suns starts with drawing a hand of ability cards from your team's deck. The deck is made up of the unique card set for each hero in the squad, and you'll get to play at least 3 cards to execute attacks, apply status effects, or set up other tactical advantages. There's no cover system, and characters can move anywhere they need to, but positioning and distance are still important factors, as there are almost always some exploding barrels or throwable debris waiting for a good use. Environmental attacks are pretty strong and occur in addition to your 3 normal actions, but also require heroism points. Heroism is gained by playing regular attack and skill cards, and can be used to fuel your most potent heroic abilities or to kick a dumpster into some bad guys. It's not uncommon to max out and deplete your heroism gauge a few times in each encounter, so the fights develop this ebb and flow as the heroes get to unleash their best stuff. Those are the basics, and it's around here that Midnight Suns gets hard to summarize, because for nearly every rule in the game, there's a hero who gets to break it. You know what I just said about spending heroism to do those environmental attacks? Spider-Man can frequently do those for free. I want to tell you that the combat is extremely transparent, with no random numbers to foil your planning, except that Nico's powers surge in some wonderfully unpredictable ways. Blade can lacerate enemies to damage them through their defensive shields, and Ghost Rider can increase his maximum health over the course of the mission. Oh, and if you don't like one of your cards, you get 1 redraw every round to replace it with a new one from the deck. Unless it's for Iron Man, Tony Stark doesn't discard his tactical options, he uses redraws to make his first idea more powerful. It's amazing to me that with 17 characters who can join your 3-person squad, every one of them brings a distinct and powerful tactical strength to the field. I'm including the Season Pass characters in that number, by the way. The base game had 13 characters, but Deadpool, Venom, Morbius, and Storm are every bit as unique and thoughtfully integrated as the rest of the crew. The objectives in Midnight Suns include things like hacking a series of terminals, acquiring a well-defended item, or protecting a group of civilians from attack. And they're generally paced to be completed in about 4 to 7 turns, which sounds much faster than most XCOM missions, but the reality for me was that the tactical considerations run so deep, with the differences between success and failure sometimes coming down to executing the plan in precisely the right order, that I was fully engaged in processing all the options. There's a lot more to say about Midnight Suns. There's a separate quest line throughout the Abbey to uncover the backstory of the people who live there, a crafting system for upgrading and then adding custom bonuses to cards for each hero. There's a special challenge mission, handmade for each character, to unlock their unique legendary ability. It's just one of those rare games where it feels like every possible facet was revisited by the developers, probably multiple times, to ensure they'd reward the player with more story, a greater connection to the characters, or even deeper tactical options in combat. This is one of those games where if any good ideas were left on the cutting room floor, I can't begin to imagine what they were. Midnight Suns was the very first game I started last year, and by the way, Forbidden West was the last game I finished in December, so take that every other year. But what set this one apart from every other game on the list is that when the final battle was done, and the credits were rolling, I was struck by how many things I still wanted to do. There were teammates I'd only just met with friendship stories and specialized mechanics that I was still excited to play with. I think that's the highest compliment that I can offer a game. That speaking as someone who enjoys a bunch of distinct genres and loves that process of diving into a fresh experience for the first time, there was only one that I was tempted to restart in New Game Plus right on the spot. That is why Marvel's Midnight Suns was the best game that I played in 2023.